Power always speaks first, until someone quieter rewrites the room. The chandelier light spilled like liquid gold across the marble floor as Ethan Caldwell adjusted his Swiss watch, its second hand ticking with precise authority. 9:10 p.m. His gala, his rules, his world, where every laugh was measured and every conversation cost more than most people made in a month. And yet in the middle of it all, there she was, Clara Whitmore, moving between tables with a tray balanced in one hand, her steps light, controlled, almost invisible. Except she wasn't invisible. Not really, not to him because she never once looked at him, not when others whispered his name, not when the room subtly bent around his presence. She simply worked, calm, focused, untouched by the gravity of wealth surrounding her. And that unsettled him just enough to make him watch longer than he should. To notice the way she placed a cup without a single ripple, the way her shoulders stayed relaxed while others stiffened under pressure, the way silence seemed to follow her. Instead of noise, Ethan leaned slightly toward his closest associate, a faint smile touching his lips, the kind that meant something was about to happen. "Watch this," he murmured, not loudly but loud enough for intention to carry, and then without raising his voice, he said it, simple, effortless, practiced. "Dance?" The word floated across the table, then across the room, and like a switch had been flipped, conversations dimmed, glasses paused mid-air. A few people laughed. Under their breath, others reached for their phones, expecting entertainment, expecting discomfort, expecting a moment they could replay later, because this was what power did, it created moments for others to react to. But Clara didn't react, not immediately. She didn't smile, didn't frown, didn't protest. She simply stood there for a fraction of a second, still as the ticking watch on Ethan's wrist, and then she placed the tray down, gently, deliberately, as if setting something more than glass and porcelain aside, as if placing down a version of herself they thought they understood. And when she stepped forward, something shifted, subtle, almost invisible but real, because in that instant, the room wasn't watching a waitress anymore. It was watching a decision unfold, and no one, not even Ethan, realized yet that he had just handed control to the quietest person in the room. The first step made no sound, but it changed everything. Her heel touched the marble like it belonged there, not as a guest, not as a performer, but as someone who understood the space in a way the room did not. The music had not started yet, and still she moved, slow, controlled, each motion deliberate, like she was listening to something no one else could hear, a rhythm beneath the silence, and the laughter that had filled the air just seconds ago began to fade, uncertain, unfinished, because what they expected was hesitation, awkwardness, something to confirm their assumptions, but Clara gave them none of that. Her posture straightened, her shoulders relaxed, her chin slightly lifted, not in defiance, not in submission, just certainty, and Ethan noticed it immediately, his fingers resting against the edge of his glass, no longer tapping, no longer restless, just still, watching, studying, because this was not how these moments usually unfolded. He had seen this game play out too many times. People either refused or performed for approval, but she was doing neither. She was not performing for them, she was not even acknowledging them, she was simply moving, and then, as if an invisible cue had been given, the music finally returned, soft at first, a classical piece that did not belong in a room filled with loud deals and louder egos, but somehow it fit her perfectly. Her body responded instantly, seamlessly, as if the sound had been waiting for her all along. She turned, one smooth rotation, balanced, precise, her foot landing exactly where it should, not a fraction of an inch off, and a woman near the front lowered her phone without realizing it, her eyes narrowing slightly, recognition flickering beneath confusion. Because this was not learned overnight, this was discipline, years of it, hidden behind a uniform. No one thought twice about. Clara's movements grew more fluid, not faster, not exaggerated, just deeper, every step connected to the next, with quiet intention, and the room followed, not because they chose to, but because they could not look away. Even the servers at the edges paused, trays in hand, caught in the same stillness that had settled over the guests, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his expression shifting, not dramatic, not obvious, but there, the faintest crack in the confidence he wore so easily, because something about this felt familiar, not the dance itself, but the presence behind it, the refusal to seek approval, the control, the silence that carried more weight than applause ever could. And as Clara moved across the floor, closing the distance between where she had stood and where he sat, the realization began to form, slow and unwelcome, that this was never his stage to begin with, that whatever he had intended with a single word had already slipped beyond his reach. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell was not the one setting the tone, he was the one trying to understand it. It happened in a moment so quiet most people did not notice it until it was already too late to look away. Clara paused mid-turn, her body perfectly balanced, one foot barely touching the ground, and for a second the entire room seemed to hold its breath with her. Then she shifted, not outward, not toward the crowd, but inward, deeper into the movement, and that was when it changed from impressive to undeniable, because this was no longer technique, this was memory. Her arms lifted with a softness that could not be practiced in a mirror, her gaze unfocused yet intentional, as if she was no longer seeing the room at all but something far beyond it. And across the floor a woman in her 60s slowly stood up from her chair, her hand pressed lightly against her chest, eyes glistening with recognition. She did not speak out loud. "That form," she whispered to no one in particular, and a man beside her frowned, trying to understand what she saw that he did not. But Ethan heard it. Even over the music, even over the silence that had replaced the earlier laughter, and something in his chest tightened, not discomfort, not exactly, but something closer to realization, because now he could see it too, not clearly yet, but enough to disturb the certainty he relied on. Clara moved again, a controlled extension, her line precise, her timing exact, every motion finishing before the next began. No rush, no hesitation, just quiet authority over her own body. And suddenly the room felt smaller, not physically, but socially, as if the hierarchy that had defined it minutes ago had dissolved without anyone announcing it. The phones that had once been raised were now lowered, forgotten in laps, and hands that no longer felt appropriate for recording, because this was not entertainment anymore. This was something personal, something that did not belong to them. And Ethan leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing not in judgment but in focus, searching his memory for where he had seen this before, because he was sure of it, a stage years ago, a performance he had attended out of obligation rather than interest, a young dancer whose name he had not bothered to remember at the time, someone introduced briefly before being replaced last minute due to an injury or a decision he had never questioned. And now that memory returned, incomplete but insistent, and his gaze fixed on Clara as she completed another turn, slower now, more deliberate, as if she understood exactly what was happening in the room and chose not to acknowledge it. And then, without warning, her eyes lifted, not to the crowd, not to the floor, but directly to him. And for the first time since this began, there was connection, not emotional, not confrontational, just clear, steady awareness. And in that look there was no challenge, no request, no need for approval, only a quiet truth that landed heavier than any words could have. And Ethan felt it, unmistakably, that this moment was no longer his to control, that whatever he had started with a single careless command had become something he could not shape, could not interrupt, could not own. And as Clara held that gaze for just a second, longer before turning away, the realization settled fully, that he was not watching a waitress prove herself. He was watching someone who had never needed to. The final note of the music lingered in the air, soft and unresolved, as Clara slowed, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same control that had defined every second before it, her movement dissolving into stillness as if the dance had simply chosen to end rather than being finished. And for a moment no one reacted, not because they did not know what to do, but because they understood that anything immediate would feel misplaced, too loud, too small for what had just happened. A glass clinked somewhere in the distance, then stopped halfway, the sound swallowed by the silence that had settled over the room, and Clara lowered her arms, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, as if nothing extraordinary had taken place, as if she had simply completed a task and was ready to return to the next. And that was what unsettled them most, not the skill, not the precision, but the absence of performance in it, the absence of any need to be seen. And across the room the woman who had stood earlier slowly sat back down, her expression no longer questioning but certain, her eyes still fixed on Clara with a quiet respect that did not need to be spoken. And one by one others followed, not with applause at first, but with something more restrained, more deliberate, hands coming together slowly, almost cautiously, as if testing whether it was appropriate to break the silence. And then it grew, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, genuine, and Ethan did not move, not immediately. His gaze still locked on Clara as she turned away from the center of the floor without acknowledging the reaction, without even glancing back. And that was when it became undeniable. This had never been about them, never been about him, and something in his chest shifted, subtle but irreversible, because for the first time that evening, he was not evaluating, not measuring, not deciding, he was simply observing. And as Clara walked back toward the edge of the room, her steps returning to the quiet rhythm they had before, the same rhythm no one had noticed until now. Ethan stood up, slowly, almost without realizing it, the movement drawing just enough attention for those nearest to glance in his direction, and when he brought his hands together once then again, it was not for show, not for the room, but for her, a recognition that did not need words, and the applause shifted, not louder but clearer, as if the room had finally aligned with something it had taken too long to understand, and Clara reached the table she had left, her hand resting briefly on the tray she had set down earlier. The same tray, the same position, everything exactly where it had been, and for a second she paused, not to take in the applause, not to acknowledge the change, but simply to exist within it without being defined by it. And then she picked it up, smooth, effortless, as if nothing had changed at all, and began to move again, past the same people who now watched her differently, past the same space that no longer felt the same, and Ethan remained standing, his watch still ticking, his world still intact, but something within it no longer fixed, because the control he thought he held had shifted in a way he could not measure. And as Clara passed his table without stopping, without speaking, without even looking at him again, the realization settled fully, quiet and undeniable, that whatever he had tried to test had revealed far more about him than it ever had about her. The room did not return to normal, not right away, because something invisible had shifted and no one knew how to reset it. Conversations resumed, but softer now, words chosen more carefully, laughter held back just a second longer than before, and Clara moved through it all as if nothing had happened, her step steady, her posture unchanged, the same quiet presence that had gone unnoticed an hour ago now drawing eyes without effort, not because she demanded attention, but because she no longer needed to avoid it. And at Ethan's table, the air felt different, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with the crystal glasses or the expensive suits. His associates exchanged brief glances, unsure whether to speak, unsure whether the moment called for humor or silence, but Ethan said nothing, his gaze following Clara as she moved past another table, refilling a glass with the same precision, the same calm, and it was that detail that stayed with him, not the dance itself but the way she returned to something so ordinary without hesitation, without pride, without even a hint of acknowledgement, as if excellence was not an event for her, but a baseline. And he found himself replaying it, the first step, the pause, the control, the look she had given him, brief but unmistakable, not challenging, not inviting, just aware, and it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain, because he was used to reactions, to people adjusting around him, rising to meet his expectations, or falling beneath them. But Clara had done neither, she had simply existed outside of that system entirely, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt the limits of something he had always assumed was unlimited, not his wealth, not his influence, but his understanding of people. And across the room, the older woman who had recognized the dance leaned toward a companion, her voice low but certain. She was trained, she said. Not casually, not briefly, but seriously. And her companion frowned, glancing back at Clara with a new kind of curiosity, one that was no longer dismissive but searching, and that quiet realization began to ripple outward, table by table, conversation by conversation, not loud enough to disrupt the evening, but present enough to reshape it. And Clara remained untouched by it all, her focus on the small details that defined her work, the angle of a plate, the placement of a glass, the timing of a step, each action carried out with the same care that had defined her movement on the floor. And Ethan finally moved, not toward the center, not to reclaim attention, but slightly to the side, his body turning just enough to follow her path, his watch still ticking steadily against his wrist, marking time in a room that no longer felt entirely his. And as Clara approached his table once more, tray in hand, her expression calm, her eyes clear, there was no trace of what had just happened reflected in her face, no expectation, no acknowledgement, just the same quiet professionalism. And when she stopped beside him, close enough for him to speak if he chose to, the silence between them stretched for a second longer than necessary, not uncomfortable, not tense, but full. And for the first time that evening, Ethan realized he did not know what to say, not because there were no words, but because none of them felt sufficient for what he had just witnessed. And Clara waited, not impatiently, not expectantly, simply present, as if giving him the space to decide whether he would remain who he had been when he spoke that single word, or become someone who understood what it had revealed. Clara did not break the silence first, she never had to, her presence had already said more than anything spoken could, and for a moment Ethan simply stood there, aware of the weight of eyes that were no longer watching him with admiration, but with something quieter, something closer to curiosity, as if they were waiting to see what he would do next, not as a host, not as a millionaire, but as a man who had just been shown something he could not immediately explain, and he exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that did not quite hide the shift beneath it. "You handled that well," he said finally, the words measured, almost careful, and Clara met his gaze just briefly, not holding it, not avoiding it, simply acknowledging it the way one acknowledges a passing detail. "It was your request," she replied, her voice calm, even without edge or softness, just clarity, and that was it, no added meaning, no attempt to elevate the moment, and somehow that made it land harder, because there was no room left for interpretation, only truth, and Ethan felt it, the simplicity of her response cutting through the complexity he was used to navigating, and for the first time that evening, he hesitated, not outwardly, not enough for most to notice, but enough for him to feel it, that small pause where certainty usually lived, and he glanced down briefly, his watch still marking time with perfect precision as if nothing had changed but everything had, and when he looked back up, Clara had already shifted her attention, not dismissively, not intentionally, just moving on, her focus returning to the table, adjusting a glass by a fraction of an inch, aligning it with the edge, a detail so small it would have gone unnoticed before, but now it felt deliberate, meaningful in a way he could not ignore, and around them, the room had resumed its rhythm, but not its hierarchy. Conversations flowed again, but softer, more aware, as if something unspoken had recalibrated the space, and Ethan's associate leaned slightly toward him, lowering his voice. "Do you know who she is?" he asked, not with arrogance but with genuine uncertainty, and Ethan did not answer right away because for once, he did not have an answer ready, and that realization settled deeper than he expected, that there were things in this room he did not control, did not own, did not even understand yet, and Clara stepped back, lifting the tray with the same effortless precision, her posture unchanged, her expression untouched by what had just passed between them, and as she turned to leave, Ethan spoke again, this time without the performance, without the audience in mind. "Clara," he said, using her name for the first time, and she paused, just slightly, not turning fully, just enough to acknowledge that she had heard him, and in that small pause, the entire weight of the moment returned, not loud, not dramatic, but clear, because this time, the next words would not be a command, not a test, but something else entirely, something he was not used to offering, and for a brief second Ethan Caldwell, a man who had built everything on certainty and control, stood at the edge of a sentence he had never practiced, aware that whatever he said next would not change who Clara was, but it might reveal who he had just become. "Wait." The word came quieter this time, not a command, not an expectation, just a request that felt unfamiliar even as he said it, and Clara paused again, her body still angled away, her hand steady beneath the weight of the tray, not turning fully, not yet, giving him only the space he had earned, nothing more, and Ethan felt that difference immediately, the absence of automatic attention, the absence of compliance he had always taken for granted, and for a brief moment he considered filling the silence with something easy, something rehearsed, but it did not come because nothing about this moment was easy, and nothing about her invited performance. "That was not normal," he said finally, the words slower than usual, chosen rather than delivered, and Clara turned her head just enough for him to see her expression, calm, unchanged. "No," she replied simply, and the simplicity of it landed again, removing any attempt to reshape what had happened into something smaller, something he could categorize and move past, and Ethan nodded once, a small movement almost to himself before continuing. "You were trained," he said, not as a question but not entirely as a statement either, and Clara met his eyes fully this time, just for a second, long enough for him to see that she understood exactly what he was asking, and exactly what he was not. "Yes," she answered, and then she waited, not to explain, not to justify, just allowing the truth to exist without decoration, and around them the room continued its softened rhythm, but the space between them remained untouched by it, held in a quiet clarity that neither of them rushed to break, and Ethan felt something shift again, deeper now, because he was used to information being offered to him, expanded, framed, made useful, but Clara offered none of that. She gave only what was true, nothing more, nothing less, and it forced him to meet it without control, without advantage, and for the first time that evening, he found himself asking something without knowing what he would gain from the answer. "Why are you here?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying more weight than he intended, and Clara's gaze did not change, did not harden or soften, it simply held, steady and present. "Working," she said, and there was no trace of irony in it, no attempt to mirror his tone, just the same grounded clarity she had shown from the beginning. And something in Ethan almost shifted into a smile, not because it was amusing, but because it was precise, because she had answered exactly what he asked, nothing more, nothing less, and left everything else unspoken. And that unspoken space said more than any explanation could have. And he realized then that whatever story he had begun to build in his mind about her, whatever assumptions he had tried to form, they were all incomplete, because she was not offering pieces for him to assemble. She was simply present, fully, without needing to be understood. And Clara adjusted her grip on the tray slightly, a small movement signaling the end of the moment, not abruptly, not dismissively, just naturally. And as she turned to continue on, Ethan did not stop her again, not because he had nothing more to say, but because for the first time, he understood that saying more would not give him control of what had already been revealed. And as she walked away, her steps as quiet and steady as before, he remained where he was, the sound of his watch steady against his wrist, marking time in a room that now felt different in a way he could not measure, aware that whatever had just begun between them was not something he could lead, only something he could choose to follow, if he was willing to see it for what it was. The distance between them did not feel the same anymore, even as Clara moved farther away, weaving through tables with the same quiet precision, because now every step she took carried context the room could not unsee. And Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze following her path, not out of habit but out of something closer to intention, as if he was trying to understand not where she was going, but how she moved through a world that did not define her. And around him, the conversation slowly regained its volume, though never quite reaching what it had been before, because something had shifted in the room's memory, something that would not fully reset. And his associate spoke again, softer this time. "You should look into her," he suggested, the tone familiar, practical, the kind that had guided 1,000 decisions before. But Ethan did not respond immediately because for once, the idea of reducing her to information, to a file, to something he could analyze and categorize, felt incomplete, almost insufficient, and he turned slightly, his eyes catching a glimpse of Clara near the far end of the room as she paused beside another table, her posture unchanged, her focus exact, and he noticed something he had missed earlier, something small but undeniable, the way people now adjusted for her, not consciously, not dramatically, but subtly, chairs shifting just a little, voices lowering just a fraction, space opening without being asked. And it was not fear, not obligation, just recognition, quiet and instinctive, and that recognition did not come from her position, it came from her presence, and Ethan felt it settle into his understanding, not fully formed, but clear enough to matter, and he exhaled slowly, his hand brushing against the edge of the table, as if grounding himself in something familiar before he reached for his glass, then stopped, leaving it untouched, because the moment did not call for habit, it called for attention. And across the room, the older woman stood once more, this time not hesitating as she approached Clara directly, her steps measured but certain, and Clara turned as she sensed her approach, her expression calm as always, and the woman spoke quietly, too far for most to hear, but close enough for Ethan to catch. "Fragments, you trained your stage." And Clara listened, not correcting, not expanding, simply acknowledging with a slight nod that carried both truth and closure. And the woman smiled, not widely but deeply, as if confirming something she had hoped to be right about, before returning to her seat without another word. And that exchange, brief and understated, landed heavier than any announcement could have because it confirmed what the room had begun to suspect, without turning it into spectacle. And Ethan watched it all, the simplicity of it, the lack of performance, the absence of any attempt to reclaim status or attention. And he understood something then, not in full but enough to change the way he saw her. That Clara was not hiding anything, she was simply not offering it, and that difference mattered, because it meant nothing about her could be taken, only recognized. And as she resumed her work, moving again through the softened rhythm of the room, Ethan straightened slightly, not out of habit, but out of a quiet decision forming beneath the surface, because for the first time that evening, he was not thinking about what he could test, or what he could gain, but about what it would mean to approach someone who did not need anything from him. And as that thought settled, steady and unfamiliar, he realized that whatever came next would not begin with a command or a challenge, but with something far more difficult, something he had not practiced in a very long time, something that required him to meet her not as the center of the room, but simply as a man standing in it. He did not call for her this time. He walked, not quickly, not slowly, just enough to close the distance without turning it into a scene, and that alone changed the way a few heads turned, because people were used to coming to him, not the other way around, and yet Ethan moved through his own gala like a guest for the first time, his steps measured, his expression calm but no longer performative, and Clara noticed him before he reached her, not because he demanded attention, but because she was aware of everything around her, always had been, and she finished placing a glass at the edge of a table before turning slightly to face him, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, giving him the same neutral space she gave everyone else, nothing more, nothing less, and for a brief second Ethan stood there without speaking, not because he did not know how, but because he was choosing not to fill the moment too quickly, and that choice, small as it was, felt unfamiliar. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, the words clear, not loud, not softened, just direct, and a nearby conversation dimmed slightly, not intentionally, but because something about the tone carried, and Clara held his gaze, not surprised, not resistant, simply present. "For what?" she asked, and the question was not challenging, it was precise, asking him to define his own meaning rather than accepting what he assumed was obvious, and Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the weight of it. "For asking you to perform," he replied. And there was no justification in it, no explanation attached, just the truth as he understood it now, and Clara considered that for a moment, not long, just enough to register it fully. "You did not ask," she said, her voice calm, "you expected." And the distinction landed quietly but firmly, and Ethan felt it, not as criticism but as clarity, the kind that did not leave room for defense, and he exhaled slightly, a breath that carried acceptance rather than resistance. "You are right," he said. And there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to reframe, just acknowledgement, and for a moment neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the silence itself had become part of the exchange, a space where meaning settled without being forced, and around them, the room continued, but more distantly now, as if the center of attention had shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be felt, and Clara adjusted the tray in her hands. A subtle signal that her time, like anyone else's, was not automatically his to hold, and Ethan noticed it, the small boundary expressed without words, and he stepped slightly to the side, not retreating, not advancing, just making space, and that too was new, and as Clara prepared to move on, he spoke once more, not to stop her, but to leave something clear behind. "That was not for us, was it?" he said, and it was not a question, not entirely, but something closer to realization spoken out loud. And Clara paused just long enough to answer, her eyes meeting his briefly, steady and unguarded. "No," she said. "It never was." And then she turned, continuing on without waiting for anything more, and Ethan remained where he was, the words settling in a way that felt final, not because the moment had ended, but because it had revealed something complete, something that did not need to be expanded or explained, and as he stood there, watching her disappear back into the quiet rhythm of the room, he understood something he had not expected to learn that night, that not everything placed before him was meant to be taken. Some things existed simply to be recognized, and whether he chose to understand them or not would define more than just the moment, it would define him. The words stayed with him longer than the music, longer than the applause, longer than anything else that had filled the night. It never was. And Ethan returned to his table without urgency, without the quiet authority that usually followed him, just walking, as if each step required a different kind of awareness now, and when he reached his seat, he did not sit immediately. His hand resting lightly on the back of the chair as his eyes moved across the room, not scanning for status, not measuring influence but observing, really observing, and for the first time, he noticed how many people were watching her, not openly, not in a way that would draw attention, but in small, repeated glances, subtle shifts of focus that returned to Clara again and again, as if something about her presence had quietly anchored the room, and he sat down slowly, his movements controlled but no longer automatic, and his associate leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You are not going to just let that go, are you?" he asked, the tone half curious, half strategic, and Ethan did not answer right away, because the question itself felt misplaced, not wrong but incomplete, as if it assumed there was something to pursue, something to obtain, and he looked down briefly, his watch still ticking with the same steady rhythm, marking seconds that no longer felt as predictable as they had before, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but different, less certain in its direction, more deliberate in its meaning. "There is nothing to take from it," he said, and his associate frowned slightly, not understanding because in their world, every moment held value only if it could be leveraged, expanded, turned into something more, and Ethan understood that perspective. He had built his life on it, but now it felt limited, and across the room Clara continued working, her movements unchanged, her focus steady, as if the earlier moment had not altered her path at all, and that contrast became clearer with every passing minute, the room adjusting, recalibrating, while she remained exactly the same, and it was that consistency that drew his attention back again, not as curiosity anymore, but as recognition, and he leaned back slightly, his gaze steady, not following her every move, but aware of her presence in a way that did not require constant attention, and the music shifted again, something softer, more ambient, filling the space without demanding it, and conversations resumed their earlier tone, but never fully returned to what they had been, because something had been introduced into the room that could not be undone, a quiet awareness that status did not always define substance, and Ethan felt it settle into him, not as a lesson, not as a realization he could articulate easily, but as a shift in perspective that would not reverse, and as the evening moved forward, he noticed smaller things, the way Clara paused to adjust a chair for someone who had not asked, the way she anticipated needs without drawing attention to it, the way she moved through complexity without becoming part of it, and each detail reinforced what had already been revealed, that what he had witnessed earlier was not an exception, it was an extension of who she was, and that understanding changed the way he saw everything else in the room, the conversations that now felt louder than necessary, the gestures that seemed more performative than before, and he found himself less interested in them, less engaged, not out of disapproval, but because something else had taken priority, something quieter, more grounded, and as he sat there, the steady ticking of his watch no longer the only rhythm he noticed, Ethan Caldwell realized that the night had not given him something to control, it had shown him something he could not, and whether he chose to ignore it or not would determine what kind of man he would be when the music finally stopped. The night moved forward, but it no longer felt like his, not in the way it had before, and Ethan remained seated longer than usual, not drawn into conversations, not pulled into negotiations, simply present in a space he had once controlled without question, and across the room, Clara continued her work with the same quiet consistency, her presence no longer invisible, but never demanding attention, and that balance stayed with him, the way she existed fully without needing to be seen, and it unsettled something deeper than he expected, because it revealed a contrast he could not ignore, between influence that required recognition and presence that did not, and as the evening softened, guests began to shift, some preparing to leave, others lingering in smaller groups, the energy no longer sharp and performative, but reflective, as if the room itself had absorbed something it could not fully explain, and Ethan finally stood again, not out of obligation, not to reclaim his role, but because something within him had reached a quiet decision, and he moved once more, not toward the center, but toward the path Clara had taken throughout the night, his step steady, his pace unhurried, and when he found her near the far end of the room, placing a final arrangement of glasses on a table that had just emptied, he did not interrupt immediately, he waited, not because he had to, but because he chose to, and that pause, small as it was, marked something new, something he had never needed to practice before, and when she turned, sensing his presence, her expression remained unchanged, calm, attentive but not expectant, and Ethan met her gaze without the edge he had carried earlier, without the quiet assumption that had once defined his tone. "The night is ending," he said, not as a statement of fact, but as an acknowledgement of something shared. And Clara nodded slightly, her eyes steady. "Yes," she replied, and the simplicity of it grounded the moment again, removing anything unnecessary, and Ethan held that space for a second longer before continuing. "You changed it," he said, and this time there was no ambiguity in his voice, no distance, just recognition, and Clara considered that, not rejecting it, not accepting it fully either, just holding it for what it was. "No," she said quietly. "It was already what it is," and the words settled between them, not as contradiction, but as clarity, shifting the perspective once more, and Ethan felt it, the subtle redirection away from her and back toward the room, toward himself, toward everything that had been revealed rather than created, and he nodded slowly, understanding not in full, but enough to feel the weight of it, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Not because there was nothing left, but because the silence had become part of the truth they were standing in. And then Clara reached for the tray beside her, lifting it with the same effortless control, preparing to move again, and Ethan did not stop her, not this time, because he understood now that stopping her was never the point, and as she turned, her steps carrying her toward the exit of the room where the staff would begin to close the night behind the scenes, he remained where he was, watching not her departure, but the space she left behind, and for the first time that space did not feel empty, it felt defined. And as the final notes of music faded into the quiet hum of a night ending, Ethan Caldwell stood still, aware that what had changed was not the room, not the event, not even the woman who had moved through it all unchanged, but something far less visible, something within him that no longer saw power the same way it had just hours before. The last guests began to leave in quiet waves, the sharp edges of the evening dissolving into softer footsteps and low, fading conversations, and the grand room that had once felt full of expectation now felt spacious, almost reflective, as if it had exhaled after holding something in for too long, and Ethan remained standing near the edge of it all, no longer positioned at the center, no longer surrounded by attention, just present, watching the final movements unfold. And across the room, Clara moved toward the service corridor, her tray now lighter, her pace unchanged, and there was something final in that direction, not dramatic, not symbolic in any obvious way, but clear enough that he understood. This was where her night ended, not on the floor where everyone had watched, not in the space where recognition had briefly shifted, but here in the quiet transition back to the unseen, and that realization stayed with him. The way her story in this room closed exactly where it had begun, without announcement, without acknowledgement, and it felt complete in a way he was not used to, because nothing had been claimed, nothing had been taken, and yet something undeniable had been left behind. And Ethan glanced once more at his watch, the second hand still moving with the same precise rhythm. But the time it marked no longer felt like something to control, just something passing, and he lowered his hand, letting it rest at his side as he took a step forward, not toward her, not this time, but toward the exit on the opposite side of the room, his path crossing the space she had moved through all evening. And as he walked, he noticed the details again, the perfectly aligned tables, the glasses placed exactly where they should be, the quiet order that remained after everything else had shifted, and he understood then that what she had done was not separate from this, it was part of it, the same discipline, the same awareness, expressed in a different form, and that connection settled into him with a clarity that did not need explanation. And near the doorway, he paused briefly, not out of hesitation, but out of acknowledgement, turning his head just slightly, not enough to seek her out, just enough to recognize the space she had occupied, and for a moment the memory of her movement returned, not as a performance, not as something to replay, but as a standard, quiet and unwavering, and he stood there in that awareness, feeling the subtle weight of it, before continuing forward, stepping out of the room without announcement, without reclaiming attention, just leaving. And behind him, the lights dimmed slightly as the staff began to close the night, their movements efficient, practiced, and somewhere within that rhythm, Clara continued, unseen again, not because she had faded, but because she had never needed to be seen to remain exactly who she was. And as the doors closed softly, separating the night from what came next, Ethan Caldwell carried with him something he could not measure, something that would not appear on any record or report, but something that would remain steady and present, long after the last light in the room had gone out. The city outside felt different, even though nothing had changed, the same streets, the same lights stretching across the skyline, the same quiet hum of traffic moving beneath the night, and Ethan stepped out onto the curb without calling for his car right away, his hand resting briefly in his pocket where his watch ticked steadily, marking time that no longer felt like something to manage, just something to move through. And he stood there for a moment, not thinking about the next meeting, not reviewing the evening as a success or a failure, just standing, letting the silence of the outside world settle in a way the room never had. And behind him, inside the building, the final lights dimmed further as the last of the staff completed their work, unseen, unnoticed, yet essential. And somewhere in that quiet rhythm, Clara Whitmore finished her shift the same way she had begun it, without announcement, without expectation, simply completing what was in front of her with the same care she had shown in every movement. And when she finally stepped out through a different door, away from the main entrance, there was no audience, no recognition waiting, just the cool night air and the soft echo of a city that did not know what had just taken place inside. And she paused for a brief second, not to reflect, not to revisit, just to exist in the stillness before continuing on. Her steps light, steady, unchanged, and across the street, Ethan noticed her without meaning to, not because she called attention to herself, but because he was no longer looking past people like her, and for a moment their paths aligned in silence, not close enough for conversation, not distant enough to ignore, just two people moving through the same space without the structure that had defined them inside. And he did not call out, did not interrupt, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to take, only something to understand. And Clara continued walking, her figure blending naturally into the rhythm of the city, no different from anyone else passing by. And yet not unnoticed, not to him, not anymore, and Ethan watched her for a second longer before turning in the opposite direction, not because he was returning to who he had been, but because he understood that whatever had shifted did not require her presence to remain. It was already part of him now, quiet, steady, and real. And as he finally stepped forward, his car pulling up beside him, the door opening with the same familiar ease, he paused just once before getting in, his gaze lifting briefly to the skyline ahead. Not measuring it, not owning it, just seeing it, and in that simple moment, the night completed itself, not with applause, not with recognition, but with something far more lasting, a quiet understanding that would not fade with the lights, that would not disappear with the end of the event. And as the car door closed softly behind him and the city moved forward as it always did, the only thing that remained unchanged was her. And the only thing that had truly changed was him, because power had not left him. It had simply been redefined, and for the first time, he carried it differently, not as something to display, but as something to measure against a standard he had not set, but had finally learned to recognize.